Welcome to the SaaS Revolution Show. I'm your host, Alex Theuma, CEO, founder of SaaStock. Delighted to be joined today by Chris Hurd, who is the founder and CEO of Firstbase. Welcome, Chris.
Great to be here, Alex. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, great to have you on the podcast. I think certainly during COVID, you definitely popped up onto my radar, and following you on Twitter, and I think you've got a very big following. I believe in talking about remote work, which was obviously the soup du jour, kind of during that time. And delighted that you come on the podcast today. So looking forward to our conversation. I guess for those we always start to just get to know you a little bit, more as a person before we kind of get into you as a CEO and what Firstbase does, etc. But tell us a little bit about who is Chris Hurd.
It's a very different answer today versus 3 or 4 years ago. So I spent 10 or 12 years as a semi-pro soccer player. As we built the business, had to dedicate all my time to that. And yeah, I think even coming to the process of building a company wasn't necessarily straightforward, as it probably isn't for most people. Studied architecture, realized pretty early on that a 6-year university degree isn't a good idea, and I wouldn't recommend that to anyone. And I knew pretty early on I didn't want to be an architect. So what that actually gave me was the opportunity to sort of free my mind and start to think about the things that I did want to do. And part of that was building a business. When you graduate, you can't do that immediately. You have to work a little bit. Worked in the oil and gas industry, learned a ton. Eventually you come to the realization that working in the oil and gas industry might not be the most intellectually stimulating industry in the world. So started doing a bunch of things out with the 9 to 5. Wrote a big blog, grew to about 50,000 people. That connected me with a bunch of interesting people in the UK startup scene, with investors in the US. And then I got to the point where it was like, well, I need to go and do something else. Do I want to go and do an MBA in the States? Do I want to go and work for some of these startups whose founders I've gotten to know? Or should I do something else? And the something else was, let's find a business and see where that goes.
Very cool. Semi-pro soccer teams, was there an aspiration to play for a particular team?
There would have been once upon a time, but I think my race was ran pretty early on in life. I had a few bad injuries. I got to 16 or 17. And at some point you have the realization that you're not going to be a total pro. You're not going to make it to the top of the game. And yeah, if you keep chasing that and you don't refocus on academics, you probably don't end up in a good place.
And given actually today and now is the first time that we've had a conversation, and but obviously I've seen you write on social media. I was expecting an American accent, but I detect a Scottish one. So when is this did you go over to the US and do the MBA and further your academia, or how did you land in the US?
Yeah. It's a common misconception. Everyone that speaks to me seems to expect me to have a Midwestern accent. And I think that's a product of a few things. You're right. It's probably the social media persona, if you put that in inverted commas. And I have spent a decent amount of time in the States. My wife's American. So though you as a Brit can probably sense the Scottish accent, a bunch of other people aren't necessarily as clear as where it's from. So no, I actually didn't do the MBA. I decided to found the business before we sort of ended up in that direction. And as we start to build the business, it becomes a lot more apparent that if you're in the US, they're a lot more conducive to risky ventures relative to Europe and certainly the UK.
And tell us then quickly about, Firstbase, what it does, but what's the founding story then? Why were you compelled to build this? What was the problem you're solving?
Yeah. So Firstbase is really straightforward. We make it really easy for companies to provide the tools and equipment their workers need wherever they are. So some people still have the conception that we are the remote company for remote workers, which we were, of course, founded under that guise. But we have clients of all sorts. We have fully remote companies, as you can imagine. We have hybrid companies, and we're starting to see companies that are fully in office as well. In terms of taking a step back, how did we end up there? In many ways, it was a mistake, right? We didn't set out to build that business. We were building a financial technology company initially. And at the outset, we made the decision we need to be a remote company. And the reason for that is all the reasons people have discovered over the last 3 to 5 years, we recognize, but there were really 3 key things for us. One, As we touched on already, I'm from Scotland. Trying to convince all the world-class people you need to move to Scotland and work in an office in the middle of nowhere. Scotland's a great place. That's a hard sell, so we didn't try and do that. Number two, we were a startup. We never had much money. Investing it in real estate seemed like a bad decision. We didn't do that either. And then number three, it was really a quality of life decision for me. I'd miss my kids, walking, laughing, talking for the first time, wanted to be there to see them grow up, wanted to spend more time with my family. But I wanted to work with the most talented people in the world, and I wanted to do the best work of my life. So naturally, the answer to that is build the company remotely. And as we started to hire people, we ran into all these challenges and obstacles. And something we were particularly passionate about was, how do we provide a great experience? How do we make sure people are as safe, comfortable, and productive at home as they were in an office? And as we get on people with calls for the first time after we hired them, we'd see them sitting at their kitchen table. We'd see them sitting at their sofa, and we'd say, you guys don't have monitors, you don't have keyboards, you don't have sort of laptops, desks, chairs. And our team would say, you guys shipped us a laptop, we don't have anything else. So we start to supply that, and then essentially one thing leads to another. You realize that that's expensive, time consuming, hard to do. As you become more globally focused, it becomes even harder. And eventually it became obvious that that was actually the problem we should be solving instead.
Very cool. And what data can you share about the business? So, I'm not sure if you said already, but I don't think I heard it, in terms of when you actually founded the business to where it is now. Like, how big is the company? How many people have you hired? You've raised capital. I remember. I feel I remember Anderson Horowitz is one of your investors. Yeah, tell us a little bit. Some metrics to give the audience to let them know.
So we founded the initial fintech business in 2018. We made the pivot to Firstbase in September 2019. Ended 21 under $1 million in revenue. Ended last year comfortably breaking through 8 figures in revenue. So that's a fairly fast ascent to there relative to the amount of time that we spent. And obviously there's a backstory to that related to how the world changed. Yep. In terms of company size, we're just over 100 people. We've raised $67 million from the likes of Andreessen Horowitz, Kleiner Perkins, and a bunch of other investors.
Very cool. And let me just ask then about Andrew. You've mentioned 2 like top tier VCs there in the fundraising process. When I guess kind of like, did you decide to raise capital, and then you kind of went out and said, okay, I'm going to go to these VCs because these are the ones that I want. This is my dream cap table, and these are the ones that I want on the board. Like, how did it work? Because I guess sometimes, obviously, it doesn't always work perfectly. But given that you've got 2 top tier VCs, just kind of curious to know, was that kind of like the dream, and you ended up landing that?
It definitely wasn't. So for us, we've always been very clear in the reason that we raise capital. It's never been a vanity metric. It's never been a sign or signal for success. And every time we've went out and raised capital, it's because we think there was a bigger opportunity to pour more petrol on the fire. So our seed round was about $2 million. We raised that in August 2020. So the whole world had already changed. And we'd seen this massive ascent in terms of the inbound that we'd seen from companies who needed help on the problems that we were solving. So the first signal to pour more petrol on the fire was that happened. We need to move faster. We need to close more customers, so on and so forth. So we closed the seed round, and we just kept getting to know other investors. And I think for me personally, if you look at what's gone on over the course of the last 3 to 5 years, there were a lot of shotgun type wedding relationships in the investment scene. And that was never for us. We always sought partners who didn't see us getting to the finish line, or what people perceive to be the finish line of an IPO. We want partners that believe getting there is just another starting line. So as we built those relationships, we got to know A16Z over 5 or 6 months. And at some point, the question becomes like, well, we've grown again. We're growing faster. We need more people. We're still seeing all this inbound. We need to catch up, sort of thing. More demand than we know what to do with. So that was a signal to do the Series A, more petrol in the fire again, build the sales team, start to build some outbound motion, and move forward. And again, copy paste for the Series B. We wanted to build relationships. Kleiner Perkins, we got to know almost immediately after closing our Series A. Fast forward 4 or 5 months, the opportunity to say, okay, well, let's move faster again was there. So I think that's somewhat unique in many ways. And I think, like I said up front, a bunch of companies don't necessarily do it for that reason. Personally, I think those are the right reasons.
So yeah, I guess kind of given the nature of when you started the company and what the company does, that COVID would have had, material impact in the growth of the business. Hence, I guess the couple of rounds that you did with A16Z and Kleiner Perkins during that time to help put fuel on the fire. Now, kind of post-COVID, so I'm interested to learn a little bit about, like, operationally how how that impacted Firstbase and you in I guess sort of rapidly scaling business and the demand that you probably had during that time. Now, COVID is over. We're in this kind of hybrid back to the office, but also, a highly accelerated remote work world as well. How has this all now, I guess the current state, impacted the business? And just interested to see over the course of like last sort of 3 years that shift. Is it that, the continued growth and, I guess kind of great demand? Is there been any kind of drop off, et cetera? Just keen to know.
It's a great question. And I think, like, always worth acknowledging the fact that COVID accelerated the trend we were betting on by 10 or 15 years overnight. That being said, take a step back. Look between 2008 and 2018. Remote work had grown 400% in the US to 3.5 million people. And the projections were, if that held, and it looked like they were, there were going to be 30 million remote workers by 2030. And you can build a generation-defining business that operationalized distributed work just targeting that. Again, COVID happens, 10 or 15-year acceleration. Go forward to now, those 30 million people are already here. That's roughly how many people are working remotely, if not full-time most of the time. And now, by 2030, we're going to have 75, 80 million remote workers globally. So the market's at least tripled. We've had this huge acceleration, and it's still there, right? The companies that are leaning into it are still leaning into it hard. I think more companies are leaning into it harder than the general population realizes, because a bunch of companies are saying one thing to the press while doing something on the other side. I think if you look at a lot of these return to office mandates, companies have been extremely aggressive. That hasn't played out. If you speak to them, if they tell you the truth, they'll tell you that occupancy daily is somewhere between 10 and 20%, and they'll tell you it's the same 10 or 20%. So that doesn't mean these mandates have happened and more people have rushed back. It means that the people that never wanted to work remotely in the first place are still not working remotely, and that's never going to change. So I think distributed work, remote work, working best actually isn't work from home on its own. It's work from anywhere. It's how can we put individuals in the best position to exceed wherever they want to work from. Second part of the question is, what was the impact on Firstbase? Pre-COVID, we'd had 500-600 companies inbound to learn more about what we were doing. That was awesome. Our product wasn't ready. So COVID happens, we rush the product out the door. Over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, we're flooded with as much demand as any company's probably ever seen in history. And I mean 12, 15,000 inbound companies, all of whom have the problem or have some semblance of the problem. So all that's played out. We're now back to a place where people can work in office if they want to. Certainly some companies are back. Most companies are working some form of sometime in the office, sometime not in the office, and a huge number of more companies are fully remote. The challenge with hybrid is even companies that want to go back more than they have actually went back now don't have enough footprint. So they're still struggling with the same problems that we solve. And I think the one thing worth calling out as well, and this is a big caveat on our business model, is famously we're looked at as being the remote company for remote workers before the world went remote. That's great. What we actually realized during the course of the world going remote is that everyone's struggling with the same problem. So it's not like we're predicated on the world being fully remote. We're not predicated on it being hybrid. We're not predicated on it being fully in office. So it's just about, do people have the pain that we have? We think they do. The market has obviously went through a lull. There's been sort of a 2021 startup bubble bursting. That has an impact on every type of startup. Fortunately, we diversified a little bit and we don't just sell to startups. So if that market slows down, we generally see acceleration in other areas.
Cool. Makes sense. And thanks for sharing that. And so I guess, and then from learning, you know, what you've just kind of talked about, want to like dive a little bit deeper into maybe like not necessarily how to make remote work, but make remote work from anywhere work, right? Because I guess like, I'm seeing what you just described in that there are a ton of 100% remote companies and a lot more. It feels that most companies that I speak to are going back into the office kind of 1 or 2 days a week, but actually not, 10 or 20% of people are going back, and there's a struggle, and like, like why are people not going back in on mandatory days and things like that. So I'll go into like maybe a couple of issues, but I guess kind of first off, maybe just around purely sort of like remote work. So I was timely listening to a podcast, I think it was yesterday actually, my trip to Dublin, where Alex McCaw, who's the founder of Clearbit, he's now doing a company called Reflect, and living on a boat and working from anywhere. So he's apparently built a boat, sailing in the Atlantic, has got Starlink, and working from there. He's now obviously, he's got a 3-person company, so clearly he's working remotely, and they don't have any meetings, and it's all asynchronous. But he did mention, there was a comment there that I picked up on, where he said like he doesn't believe that if you're building a venture-backed company that you can do that as a remote business. That for a venture-backed company that you need to be in person, you need in person for trust, you need to break bread with people. What are your thoughts around that sort of statement, given that you're venture-backed as well?
Yeah, I would say we clearly aren't working in that model, and then it's up for people to debate whether that's working or not, right? Like, yeah. I think people can have their opinions, but I think the fact is this is playing out very clearly for a bunch of companies in that it's working. Now, anytime there's anything new, there's always going to be doubt. There's always going to be some people that don't trust it. I think that's totally fine. Innovation across history has been filled with times where people thought things would be one way, and then something new emerges. So the horse to the car to airplanes, so on and so forth. Like innovation, that is the classic innovator's dilemma. Now, right now, there's still a visualization from a lot of leaders, particularly middle managers, particularly older people, who are struggling with this. They don't know how to operate. It's not the same as what they know in office. They're lacking the command and control type ability to influence people, and they still judge performance based on how long someone's sitting in a seat. Now, some people might have the view, well, in a startup, that's what's necessary. I would have a slightly different view, which is if you're incredibly clear on what outcomes you need to hit, is time a metric, or do you just care what someone produces? So I think that's the first part. Like, distributed companies need to be crystal clear on the outcomes that they need to choose. The second part is if they're going to try and operate in the way that they would have in office, probably not going to work, right? Like synchronous work is really hard if people are in different time zones. Now, if you want to replicate office working remotely, you probably shouldn't work remotely because you're not leveraging the benefits. The benefits are you can hire people anywhere, you can hire the most talented people in the world, not the most talented person you can afford in a 30-mile radius of your office, and you can put people in a position to do the best work that they've ever done in their lives because they can do their best work, organize life around that, and work when they're most productive. So if I hire someone as a CEO and they do their best work from 5 a.m. till 11 a.m., they then take 2 hours off in the afternoon to cycle a bike, they do something else, and then they come back online from 3 to 8 p.m. Why would I stand in the way of that? Doesn't make any sense, right? And especially if you look at the knowledge-based economy, which arguably every tech business is in, a bunch of other industries, they're also in that industry now. The most talented company wins. And if you want to hire the most talented people, you need to meet them where they are. The vast majority of people never want to go back to an office again full time. So if you put yourself in a position where you're saying, this is the only thing that we're going to do, how can you, by definition, be the most talented company?
It makes sense. And I think there's got to be like obviously treating people like adults, right? And giving them the trust. And I think, as you say, the big thing sort of picking up from that is like, look, I mean, if they're doing their best work and it's deep work and it's from home and they're hitting results, like, why does it matter like where they are or what they're doing or how many hours they're working? Do they have to work 8, 9 hours, or could they be doing 4 or 5? Like what I've seen, and like in terms of these are some like personal experiences, but like from my own company, but other companies as well, that obviously we've got a lot of exposure to SaaS startups in terms of the issues. Often they seem to be around like culture and burnout in this kind of work from anywhere sort of hybrid world, right? And so like certainly during COVID, and when we all of a sudden transitioned to 100% remote because we had no other choice, and we were also, you know, kind of backs to the wall and all hands to the pump, because for us as a business, you know, we went from organizing large in-person gatherings, you know, the SaaStock conference in Dublin, to virtual conferences and virtual events, and doing those almost every week. And, you know, it was certainly overkill. And during that time, I think for obvious reasons, and given COVID was going on, we struggled to adapt to, like, you know, the culture, like we saw the change for the culture of the business to, you know, to the negative. And then, you know, there was a lot of burnout, and that was the kind of really the first time that we started to experience that and see that within the business. And I think sort of like even now, and certainly things improved, and we've actually moved to like a 4-day work week, 6 months of the year. But so 5 months, the other 6 months of the year, we go to 5 days, because when we're near the time of our conferences, we've just got a lot to do, and we need we feel we need those extra days of productivity. And those are some of the things that, one of the things that we've done to kind of help there. But still in the hybrid world, where we're pretty much in the office 1 day a week, it's supposed to be 2, but really the reality is it's 1 day a week. My feeling is that the culture is still not what it was as when we were 4 days a week in the office, sort of pre-COVID. And the topic of burnout is, you know, something that is not almost ever present, but it comes up, you know, kind of like every now and then, a bit like a roller coaster. And I imagine you've probably seen this more than, not necessarily within your own company, but given that you know, you've got so many thousands of companies that you're looking at this probably more than most. I guess the question is, like, how do you adapt and optimize culture, you know, for remote work, and also like around burnout? You know, what are the things that you see around that to help avoid it, I guess?
Yeah, so burnout's an interesting thing, because what you hear from some people is, we can't trust people to work remotely because they're not going to work hard enough. And all evidence is they're working too hard and they're burning out. So like, how can you have it both ways? They're either not working hard enough, in which case the evidence is clear that they're not burning out, or they're working too hard and they're working too many hours and they're burning out. So the first part is like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it. It either works or it doesn't. If they're working out, like if they're burning out, the question is actually, how do we stop them burning out? And that is just being more purposeful around, are people taking enough time off? Do we make it acceptable to sign out because there is less of a line between work and life? So I think that's the first part. And there's some process things that companies can put in place to help that. And I think GitLab and Darren Murph in particular spend a decent amount of time. Darren, when he was at GitLab, spent a decent amount of time writing about this. Now, the second part on culture, again, I think this is one of the famed tropes used to try and put remote work and distributed work down. And I think some ways, my experience, the things I've seen in the companies I work with, isn't that remote work destroys culture. In many ways, it reveals it. And what I mean by that is that culture in office is there. It happens, you experience it, you're part of it, and you can't avoid it. It just is. It's ephemeral. It changes, and it's maybe harder to change over time, but it's inarguable that it exists. In a remote world, that isn't the same case. You do need to be a lot more purposeful. You need to be explicit in saying, like, well, actually, team, we do need to spend some time on communication and collaboration skills. Otherwise, they might deteriorate. And if they deteriorate, we're not going to be as productive and effective and efficient as we need to be. So I think it's important to also say that being a distributed company, being fully remote, shouldn't mean that you never spend time together in person. Time together in person is critical. For me, I'm not as focused on culture. I actually care a lot more about community because I think it's more inclusive. And I think then you need to start to realize that culture is very different to an office, and that's neither good or bad. I think a lot of people still have good experiences of the office. I would say they're overly positive just based on the fact we had a 2 or 3 year pandemic in there where people never really seen other people. which is a big problem. It wasn't just colleagues, it was friends, family, it was travel, it was restaurants, it was everything else. So I think now that we're through that, people can spend more time with their families, they can travel more. They have connection outside of work as well, which I think is really, really important. And then the piece that comes after is, okay, well, assuming we are a remote company, how can we be purposeful about this? How frequently do we need to come together in person? What do we need to do when we do come together in person? And then I think you can start to broaden the aperture and say, well, what does this give us in terms of benefit that an office doesn't give us? And potentially what it gives companies is access to a more diverse company, right? It's not just we can hire people that can attend an office. It's not just people that are comfortable working in an office. Certain demographics have obviously been the beneficiaries of that over time. It becomes, actually, can we hire single parents? Actually, can we hire people with health conditions or impairments who can't work in an office? And I think as you start to paint the picture of culture, diversity should be an integral part to that. And again, not better, but different.
I'm going to move into the quick-ish fire round now, Chris, as I'm sort of conscious of time. What one thing has moved the needle the most for you in your career?
Writing.
Well, certainly it's how I first got to hear of you. What's the best advice you've ever received?
Probably early in my life from my dad. He always said, treat people the way you want to be treated and work as hard as you can. So very simple, very British.
It's simple but very good advice. What's the biggest failure you've made and lesson learned?
I think there's always reflections to learn on. I'll take a recent one. I think given the way the macroeconomic trends shifted over the course of the last 12 years, we weren't quick enough to realize that our initial ICP and target ICP was starting to change. And if we changed earlier, I think we'd have grown even faster.
What's the hardest thing about building a work from anywhere business?
The hardest thing is purpose. Like everything has to be a conscious choice. Otherwise it doesn't happen. Like in office, spoke about this a minute ago, like you can just experience the office. Remote doesn't happen like that. If you don't push every day, sometimes things don't go forward.
What does your daily routine look like? And does it include 2-hour bike rides?
It does not. My day looks very different depending on what day it is. So because I have a bunch of the team in the US, I get all my focused work done in the morning. I have some external meetings early afternoon, and then into the evening I'll have my US-based meetings. And yeah, I try and get a bike ride in, but usually it's about 15, 20 minutes as opposed to 2 hours.
What do you do to unwind from work, or can you?
I read a lot.
What are you currently reading?
Magic Words, Jonah Berger.
Okay. I don't know that one, but we'll look it up. That was the end of the quickish fire round. Thanks for that, Chris. Just to kind of wrap up, where can people find you online? So where are you most active? I might guess it might be Twitter, but I don't know if that's changed since Elon is there, and your thoughts on that. And also Firstbase, where if they want to learn more, where do they go?
Yeah, I'm at Chris_Hurd on Twitter, Chris Hurd on LinkedIn. You'll see me with a pink background on some social media platform, and Firstbase is at firstbase.com.
Very good. Well, Chris Hurd, CEO founder of Firstbase, thanks so much for coming on the SaaS Revolution Show today. Really appreciate you sharing your lessons and thoughts on working from anywhere, and congrats on building a great business.
Thanks for that, Alex. Appreciate your time.